Tea's a funny thing, the way a single, ordinary Tuesday can unravel the tapestry of a lifetime. The threads you thought were woven tight, the patterns you'd long stopped questioning, can all come loose with a single, gentle pull. For me, that pull happened in the checkout aisle of a Walmart, under the sterile hum of fluorescent lights and the cheerful, indifferent beeping of a cash register. The air smelled of floor polish and popcorn, a uniquely American scent of convenience and consumption. I was standing in line, my cart filled with the mundane necessities of a life lived for others. Robert's preferred brand of decaf coffee, the low-sodium soup he needed for his blood pressure, the multi-grain bread he'd barely touch but would complain if it wasn't there. My own needs were a small footnote in the cart, a bar of lavender soap, a magazine I'd likely never find the time to read. Ahead of me was a woman. She wasn't old, perhaps in her late 40s, but she was worn in a way that time alone doesn't account for. It was in the slump of her shoulders, the way her frayed coat collar curled up around a neck that seemed too thin to hold the weight of her head. Her hair was pulled back in a severe, functional knot, and strands of weary gray escaped around her temples. Her cart was the opposite of mine. It was full of a desperate kind of hope. A small, slightly garish birthday cake, a packet of cheap balloons, a generic brand of macaroni and cheese, hot dogs, and a large bag of store-brand potato chips. It was a child's birthday party on a shoestring, and my heart, a tired and calloused old thing, gave a painful little lurch of recognition. I knew that kind of shopping. I knew the careful calculations, the silent prayers at the checkout, the feeling of your stomach tightening as each item is scanned. The total came to $132 and some change. I watched as she slid her card into the machine. A moment passed. The light on the machine blinked red. Declined. The cashier, a young girl with bored eyes and blue-streaked hair, announced it without a trace of emotion. It's not going through. The woman's face, already pale, lost any remaining color. It was a specific kind of public shame that I hadn't felt in decades, but that my body remembered like a phantom limb. She fumbled in her purse, her hands shaking. I'm sure there's enough. Can you try it again, please? The cashier sighed, a gust of teenage impatience, and ran it again. Red light. Declined. The man behind me shifted his weight, his heavy sigh a cannon blast in the quiet humiliation of the moment. The woman began the terrible triage. Okay, she whispered, more to herself than to the cashier. Okay, take the cake off. And the balloons. And the chips. Her voice was thin, brittle, about to shatter. The child's birthday party was being dismantled, piece by painful piece, right there on the conveyor belt. And that's when I stepped forward. It wasn't a grand decision. It wasn't born of noble charity. It was a reflex. It was the ghost of a younger me, a me that had once stood in a similar line, trying to buy medicine for a sick child while my husband's paycheck was still days away, feeling the hot stare of judgment on my back. I reached into my purse, pulled out my own card, and held it out to the cashier. I'll get it, I said, my voice steadier than I felt. Put her things with mine. The woman turned to me, her eyes wide with a mixture of shock and disbelief. Oh, no, you can't. I couldn't possibly. It's just a little help, I said, trying to offer a small, reassuring smile. I didn't want her gratitude. I just wanted the moment to be over for her. I wanted her to be able to take that birthday cake home. Happy birthday to whoever's birthday it is. Tears welled in her eyes, big, fat tears that traced clean paths through the weariness on her cheeks. It's my son's, she choked out. He's turning 10. Thank you. I don't know what to say. My name is Chloe. It's my pleasure, Chloe, I said. The transaction was finished. I paid for her groceries and my own, a single, anonymous act. She thanked me again, her voice thick with emotion, and then she was gone, pushing her cart with its resurrected birthday party out into the gray Ohio afternoon. I didn't think much of it as I loaded my own bags into the car. It was a nice thing to do, a small ripple of kindness in a world that often felt like a stagnant pond. It wasn't until I was driving home, turning onto Sycamore Lane where I've lived for 45 years, that her name echoed back to me. Chloe. It was a pretty name. But it was the last name she'd mumbled through her tears that suddenly snagged in my memory. I'd barely registered it at the time, but now it surfaced, sharp and clear. Vance. Her name was Chloe Vance. Vance. The steering wheel felt cold and slick in my hands. I had to pull the car over to the curb, right there in front of Mrs. Gable's perfectly manicured lawn. My heart was hammering against my ribs, not with the gentle rhythm of a 68-year-old woman, but with the frantic, panicked beat of a girl of 23. Vance. That was Eleanor's married name. Eleanor Vance. The woman who had been the shadow in my marriage, the ghost at my dinner table, the yardstick against which I was always measured and always found wanting. Robert's first love. The one he'd let get away. And Chloe. Chloe would be her daughter. I sat there in my beige sedan, the engine idling, and the world outside my windshield seemed to tilt on its axis. The quiet, tree-lined street, the familiar brick houses, the very air I was breathing, it all felt alien. I had just paid for the birthday party of the granddaughter of my husband's great love. A woman whose poverty was so stark, so visible, that I, the woman who had won, had stepped in to save her from public disgrace. The irony was so thick, so bitter, I felt I might choke on it. This single act, this small payment of $130, had not been a simple act of charity. It was a stone tossed into the deep, dark well of my past, and the ripples were now coming back to me, carrying with them the debris of a lifetime. The memories started to rise, unbidden and unwelcome. I remembered the early days with Robert. I was Evelyn Miller then. I worked as a librarian's assistant, and I loved the quiet order of the books, the smell of paper and binding glue. Robert Carter was a young accountant, ambitious and handsome, with a serious set of shoulders and a smile that, in those days, seemed to promise a future as solid and dependable as a fortress. He courted me with a kind of formal intensity. He brought my mother flowers. He impressed my father with his talk of 5-year plans and investment portfolios. He made me feel chosen, safe. The name Eleanor was mentioned even then, but always in hushed, reverent tones, like a story of a fallen saint. They had been high school sweethearts. She was the one, everyone had thought. But her family had moved away, and she had married someone else, a man with better prospects, Robert had said with a flicker of old resentment in his eyes. He told me it was ancient history. He told me he was lucky in the end because he had found me. I believed him. I wanted to believe him. A woman in love is a master of belief. We bought the house on Sycamore Lane. It was a modest brick colonial, but to me, it was a palace. It was the container for all my hopes. I would fill it with love, with the smell of baking bread, with the laughter of children. I would make it a home so warm and bright that no shadows from the past could ever creep in. But shadows don't need a key. They seep in through the cracks. The first crack appeared not long after we were married. It wasn't a fight. Fights are honest, in their own way. They are a clash of two wills. This was something different. This was a quiet erosion. I had decided to paint the small sunroom. I bought canvases and brushes and tubes of bright, optimistic paint. I had always loved to draw as a girl, and I imagined filling the walls with landscapes, with flowers, with light. I set up my easel one Saturday, the clean white canvas practically vibrating with possibility. Robert came in, holding his coffee cup. He watched me for a moment, a small, unreadable smile on his face. "What's all this, Evie?" he asked. "Going to be our own little Picasso, are we?" It wasn't what he said. It was the tone. A silken, condescending amusement. It was the same tone a father might use for a child playing with finger paints. It instantly made my ambition feel foolish, childish. "I just thought I'd try it," I said, my enthusiasm already starting to curdle. "The room gets such lovely light." "Well, don't make a mess," he said, turning to leave. Eleanor was quite the artist, you know. Her watercolors were astonishing. She had a real gift. Almost went to art school. And then he was gone. I stood there in the sun-drenched room, the smell of turpentine suddenly acrid and suffocating. My bright, hopeful paints seemed garish. My clean canvas was no longer a field of possibility. It was a stark white indictment of my own inadequacy. He hadn't told me not to paint. He hadn't forbidden it. He had done something far more effective. He had held up the ghost of Eleanor, the true artist, and in her perfect, imaginary light, my small attempt was cast into shadow. I put the paints away that afternoon. I never took them out again. The sunroom became a place for storage. The easel gathered dust in the attic for 20 years before I finally gave it to Goodwill. That was Robert's way. He was never a brute. He never raised his voice, never threw a punch. My bruises weren't the kind you could show to anyone. They were on the inside, deep in the marrow of my self-worth. His weapon was comparison. His ammunition was quiet disappointment. He built a cage for me not with iron bars, but with the gossamer threads of my own insecurity, threads he so expertly spun. When I wanted to join a book club, he remarked that it seemed like a silly excuse for women to gossip. Eleanor read proper literature, he'd say. Dostoevsky, Tolstoy. Not these popular novels. So I read alone in bed after he was asleep. When I made a new friend, a cheerful, vibrant woman from the neighborhood named Carol, he would find subtle ways to undermine her. She seems a bit loud, doesn't she? Or is her husband really happy with her working full-time? He made me feel that my choices, my friends, my very tastes were second-rate. Slowly, without even realizing it was happening, my world began to shrink until it was the size of our house, the size of his approval. Then our son, Michael, was born. For a while, the joy was so immense it pushed everything else away. Holding my son, I felt a sense of purpose that was entirely my own. He was mine, but Robert saw him differently. He saw him as a legacy, a Carter. He was obsessed with Michael's progress, his milestones. He'd time his crawling, chart his vocabulary. My role was simply to facilitate the development of this future titan. My instincts, my mother's intuition, were dismissed as sentimental nonsense. "Don't coddle him, Evelyn," he'd say, when I'd rush to comfort a crying baby Michael. "You'll make him soft. A boy needs to be tough." He was building a cage for my son, too, and I was expected to be the zookeeper. The fights we had, the real, door-slamming fights, were almost always about Michael. I fought for Michael's right to be a child, to be sensitive, to be himself. And in those fights, Robert's control would slip, and a sliver of the cold, hard man beneath the polished surface would show. "You don't know what a man needs, Evelyn," he'd say, his voice low and dangerous. "You think life is one of your little paintings or silly books. It's not. It's a competition. And I will not have my son starting from a disadvantage because his mother is a sentimental fool." And always, always, there was the ghost. When Michael struggled with math in 3rd grade, Robert said, "Eleanor was a math prodigy. It's a shame Michael didn't inherit that kind of mind." He said it as if it were my fault, as if I had diluted the superior Carter-Eleanor gene pool with my own inferior blood. 2 years after Michael, our daughter, Sarah, was born. I had been so excited. A daughter. A little ally. A girl I could share my softer world with. Robert's reaction was quiet. It was a quiet disappointment. He had wanted another son. He took one look at the pink, wrinkly bundle in my arms and said, "Well, a girl." He was never cruel to Sarah. He was, in some ways, worse. He was indifferent. She was my project. He paid for her dance lessons and her school clothes, but his emotional investment was nil. She was a resident in his house, but not an heir to his kingdom in the way Michael was. This indifference, paradoxically, gave me a small pocket of freedom. With Sarah, I could be the mother I wanted to be. I could coddle her. I could read her fairy tales. I could encourage her gentle, artistic spirit without Robert's constant, critical oversight. She became my confidant, my little shadow. But I saw the toll it took on her, too. She spent her childhood trying to win a single crumb of her father's attention, an attention he reserved almost exclusively for Michael. She would bring home straight-A report cards, and he would glance at them and say, "Good job," before turning to Michael to ask about baseball practice. The pain of being invisible is a unique kind of pain, and I watched my daughter learn it at her own father's dinner table. My life became a careful balancing act. I was a diplomat in a Cold War, navigating the tensions between my husband and my children, between my husband and myself. I managed the household finances on the strict allowance Robert provided me from his salary, a salary that I had, in the early years, contributed to with my own paycheck before he'd suggested it would be better for the children if I stayed home. I hosted his business dinners, smiling and playing the gracious hostess, my stomach in knots, praying I wouldn't say or do something that would earn me a cold, dissecting lecture on the car ride home. Did you have to talk so much about the garden, Evelyn? Mr. Henderson is a man of finance. He's not interested in your petunias. I became an expert at reading the weather of his moods. I knew the subtle tightening of his jaw that meant a storm was coming. I knew the specific, dismissive way he'd fold his newspaper that meant any topic I brought up would be shot down. I learned to live in the spaces he left for me, the small, quiet corners of the day where I could be myself. In the garden, with my hands in the dirt. In the kitchen, with the radio playing softly while I cooked. In Sarah's room, reading stories aloud and feeling, for a little while, like a person with a voice. Years turned into decades. The children grew up. Michael became a miniature Robert, an investment banker, driven, successful, and emotionally distant. He married a woman who looked, I always thought, a little bit like the old photographs of Eleanor. He calls on holidays and sends expensive, impersonal gifts. Sarah, my Sarah, became a school teacher. She has a huge heart, a gentle soul, and a lingering sadness in her eyes that I know I am partly responsible for. She lives 2 states away, and we talk on the phone every day. She is the one true, uncomplicated joy in my life, but I know she carries the wounds of her father's indifference. Robert and I grew old. The sharp edges of his control softened into the dull habits of a long, loveless marriage. We didn't fight anymore. There was nothing left to fight about. The war was long over, and I had long ago surrendered. We lived together in the house on Sycamore Lane like 2 polite, familiar ghosts, bound by a shared history that we never, ever spoke of. The silence in our house was immense. It was filled with all the things I had never said, all the dreams I had packed away, all the hurts I had swallowed. And then, a Tuesday at Walmart. A woman named Chloe Vance and a child's birthday cake. As I finally put the car in gear and drove the last few feet into my driveway, the house looked different. It didn't look like a palace anymore. It looked like a mausoleum, a monument to a life half-lived. I walked inside. Robert was in his armchair, watching the evening news. He didn't look up. "You were gone a while," he said, his eyes fixed on the television. The lines were long, I said. The old, familiar lie. The lie of omission. I went into the kitchen and began to unpack the groceries. The decaf coffee. The low-sodium soup. The bread. My life in a paper bag. I put everything away, my movements automatic, honed by 45 years of practice. But my mind was a whirlwind. Chloe Vance. Eleanor's daughter. Living in poverty. Trying to buy her son a birthday cake. All those years, Eleanor had been a goddess in my mind, a creature of impossible perfection. Robert had painted her as brilliant, beautiful, accomplished. The woman who had married a wealthier, more successful man. The life she'd had was the one I was implicitly failing to create. And yet, here was her legacy, her daughter, her own flesh and blood, unable to afford $130 for groceries. What had happened? What had become of the great Eleanor and her wealthy husband? What tragedy had befallen them that had left their daughter in such a state? For the first time, the ghost of Eleanor Vance was not a shimmering, perfect phantom. She was a real woman, a woman whose life had clearly contained its own pain, its own failures. A woman whose daughter now wore the same look of quiet desperation I once had. I stood at the kitchen sink, my hands gripping the cool edge of the porcelain, and stared out the window at the darkening backyard. The yard I had so lovingly tended for decades. My petunias. My roses. The one place that was truly mine. For 45 years, I had lived in the shadow of a story told by my husband to keep me small, to keep me in my place. A story of his perfect, lost love. And on a random Tuesday, a chance encounter in a Walmart had just revealed that the story was a lie. Or, if not a lie, then a version of the truth so incomplete as to be a lie. My entire marriage, the entire structure of my emotional life, had been built on a faulty foundation. I had spent a lifetime feeling second best to a woman who, it turned out, may have been just as broken and human as I was. Robert called from the living room. "Evelyn, is dinner ready yet?" His voice, usually just a part of the house's familiar soundscape, struck me like a physical blow. I looked at my reflection in the dark glass of the window. I saw an old woman with gray hair and tired eyes. A woman who had learned to be quiet, to be small, to take up as little space as possible. I had paid for a stranger's groceries. A simple act. But as I stood there, looking at the stranger I saw in the glass, the stranger I had become, I had to wonder, who was going to pay for me? What was the price of my own life, and who was left to settle the bill? The questions hung in the silent kitchen, vast and terrifying and, for the first time in a very long time, demanding an answer. And I knew, with a certainty that chilled me to my very soul, that this was not the end of the story. It was just the end of the beginning. Dinner that night was a silent, three-act play, performed on the small stage of our dining room for an audience of one, me. The first act was the serving. I placed Robert's plate in front of him, roast chicken, potatoes, green beans, the same meal I'd made 1,000 Tuesdays before. But my hands were not my own. They felt detached, like a stranger's hands moving with a precision that had nothing to do with my own splintered thoughts. I watched him pick up his fork, his movements as predictable as the setting sun, and for the first time, I didn't see my husband of 45 years. I saw a curator. A man who had spent his life carefully managing a museum of his own ego, and I was his most prized and most neglected exhibit. Every memory of him was now being recatalogued in my mind, moved from the section marked husband to a new, terrifying wing I had just discovered, one labeled deception. He salted his potatoes, a deliberate, controlled shake of the wrist. He had always salted his food before tasting it, an act of supreme confidence in his own palate and a subtle dismissal of mine. Tonight, that small, insignificant gesture felt like a confession. He had judged my cooking and my entire life without ever truly tasting it. The second act was the eating. The only sounds were the scrape of his fork on the ceramic plate and the muffled drone of the television from the other room, where the world's tragedies were being neatly packaged into 2-minute segments. The silence between us was no longer the comfortable, worn-out silence of a long marriage. It was a screaming void. It was filled with the name Chloe Vance. It was filled with the image of a declined credit card and a collapsing birthday party. It was filled with 45 years of comparisons to a woman who, it now seemed, had lived a life as fractured as my own, if not more so. I pushed a green bean around my plate, the motion hypnotic. I kept seeing Eleanor's face as I imagined it from the old black and white photos Robert kept in a box in his study. The perfect, smiling girl, forever frozen at 18. What had happened between that smile and her daughter's desperate face in a Walmart checkout line? I looked at Robert, chewing his chicken methodically. Did he know? Did he have any idea that the goddess he had placed on a pedestal had fallen so completely? Had he kept in touch? Or had he, like me, simply accepted the story he created and never bothered to check the facts? The questions were a swarm of bees in my head, and I had to press my lips together to keep from letting one of them fly out and sting the silent air between us. The third and final act was the clearing. He pushed his plate away, a signal that he was finished. He folded his napkin and placed it on the table. "That was adequate, Evelyn," he said. Adequate. The word he had used to describe my cooking, my housekeeping, my very being for most of our life together. It was a word that both acknowledged my effort and dismissed it in the same breath. Usually, I would have murmured a quiet, "I'm glad you enjoyed it," and cleared the table. But tonight, the word adequate landed like a slap. My life, my sacrifices, my suppressed dreams, my lonely hours, they were adequate. I stood up and my chair scraped against the wood floor, a sound louder than any I had made at this table in years. Robert glanced up, a flicker of surprise in his placid blue eyes. I gathered his plate, the silverware, my hands trembling now, not with fear, but with a cold, clear rage that was so unfamiliar it felt like it belonged to another person. I carried the dishes into the kitchen and did not come back. I left him there at the table with his folded napkin and his adequacy. I stood at the sink, my back to the dining room, and turned on the water, letting the sound drown out the world. I wasn't just washing the dishes. I was trying to wash away the feeling of his judgment, a film that had coated my life for so long I had mistaken it for my own skin. Sleep, that night, was not a refuge. It was a courtroom. And I was the sole witness, being cross-examined by my own memories. Every time I closed my eyes, a new scene from my past would play out on the dark screen of my eyelids, recontextualized by what I now knew. I remembered a time, maybe 15 years into our marriage, when I had desperately needed a new winter coat. My old one was threadbare at the cuffs, the lining torn. It was a source of quiet shame every time I wore it to the grocery store or to pick Sarah up from school. Robert's accounting firm had had a very good year. He'd bought himself a new set of golf clubs and a ridiculously expensive watch that he would polish with a soft cloth while he watched television. Money was not the issue. Control was that I had to ask for the money for the coat. I had to sit him down in his study, the room that always smelled of leather and his self-importance, and make my case. I felt like a child asking for a larger allowance. "Robert," I began, my voice small. "My coat is really falling apart. I was hoping I could get a new one before it gets much colder." He didn't look up from the papers on his desk. He made me wait. The silence stretched, thick with my humiliation. Finally, he looked at me over the top of his reading glasses. "A new coat? Evelyn, do you have any idea how much a quality coat costs?" "We have a budget." "I know," I said, my cheeks burning. "I wouldn't get anything extravagant. Just something warm. From the department store." He sighed, a great, theatrical sigh of a man burdened by the frivolous demands of his family. "I just don't think you understand finances, Evelyn. It's not about just one coat. It's about the precedent. It's about discipline." He then launched into a 10-minute lecture on fiscal responsibility, using terms like capital outflow and discretionary spending, terms designed to make me feel foolish and incompetent. In the end, he wrote me a check, but for an amount that was $20 less than the plain, sensible coat I had picked out. He did it on purpose. I knew he did. It was to ensure that I couldn't even have the small victory of getting the exact thing I wanted. It was to remind me that he was the one in charge. I ended up buying a cheaper, thinner coat that was never quite warm enough. For years, every time I shivered in the winter wind, I was reminded of that conversation, of the feeling of being a beggar in my own home. Lying in bed now, 40 years later, I felt that same phantom chill. And I thought of Chloe Vance, her face pale as her card was declined. I had saved her from that specific public humiliation, but I had lived with the private version of it for my entire adult life. The night dredged up other ghosts, too. The ghost of my friendship with Carol. Carol had been my one real friend in the neighborhood. She was loud and funny and saw the world in bright, vibrant colors. She'd pop over for coffee, and we would laugh until tears streamed down our faces. She saw me. She saw the Evelyn that existed outside of being Robert's wife and Michael and Sarah's mother. Robert, of course, despised her. He never said it directly. He was too clever for that. Instead, he employed a campaign of quiet sabotage. If Carol was coming over, he would suddenly need the car, or he would schedule a repairman to come, disrupting our time. He would make comments after she left. "I'm not sure she's a good influence on Sarah, Evelyn. She's so boisterous." Or her poor husband. "I saw him the other day. He looks exhausted." I suppose that's what happens when a wife has too much free time on her hands. He was poisoning the well, drip by slow drip. The final blow came when I invited Carol and her husband, Tom, for dinner. I spent 2 days cleaning the house, planning the menu, trying to make everything perfect. I wanted Robert to see that my friends were good, decent people, that I was capable of having a sophisticated social life. The evening was a disaster. Robert was polite, but with a condescending air that set everyone's teeth on edge. He'd correct me on small details of a story I was telling. He'd steer the conversation toward finance, a topic he knew Tom, a history teacher, had little interest in. He'd ask Carol pointed questions about her career, framing them as though it were a quaint little hobby. The air grew thick with unspoken tension. After they left, after I had smiled and waved from the doorway until their car was out of sight, I closed the door and leaned against it, my perfect hostess facade crumbling. Robert was already in the living room, loosening his tie. "Well," he said, with a tone of finality, "I think we can agree that was an experiment not to be repeated." "What are you talking about?" I asked, my voice shaking. "They're our friends." "They're your friends, Evelyn," he corrected me. "And frankly, they're not our sort of people. He's a high school teacher, for God's sake. And she has opinions on everything. It's unseemly in a woman." He picked up the newspaper. Eleanor's friends were all from very good families. Their husbands were doctors, lawyers. The conversation was always stimulating. And there she was again, Saint Eleanor of the stimulating conversation. My friendship with Carol, my one source of light and laughter, had been measured against some imagined, perfect dinner party from his youth and had been found wanting. Carol must have felt the chill from him, too. She called less frequently after that. Our coffee dates became shorter, more strained. The easy laughter was gone. Eventually, the invitations stopped altogether. She moved away a few years later, and we lost touch. Robert had won. He had successfully isolated me, trimming my world down to the exact dimensions he required. Lying there in the dark, I mourned that friendship all over again, but this time, I didn't mourn it as a sad, inevitable loss. I mourned it as a theft. He had stolen her from me. Morning finally came, a pale, gray light filtering through the blinds. Robert was already up, dressed, gone for his early morning walk. The house was quiet. I felt hollowed out, scoured clean by the night's relentless memories. But amidst the exhaustion, there was something else. A small, hard kernel of resolve. I could not go back to sleep. I could not go back to the way things were. The story of Eleanor Vance had been the bedrock of my marriage. Now that the bedrock had been revealed as sandstone, I had to know what was underneath. I had to know the truth. Not for revenge. Not to confront Robert. Not yet, anyway. I had to know for me. I had to know what my life had been sacrificed for. I made my way downstairs, my bare feet cold on the hardwood floors. In the corner of the living room sat our old desktop computer, a dusty relic we'd bought years ago that I mostly used for looking up recipes. Robert disdained it. He had a sleek, modern laptop he kept in his study. This old, slow machine was mine. I sat down in front of it, the chair creaking in protest. It took an eternity to boot up, the whirring of its internal fan sounding like an old man clearing his throat. I opened the internet browser. The blank search bar seemed to be waiting, a vast, white emptiness. What was I even looking for? My fingers trembled as I typed. Chloe Vance, Ohio. A few results popped up. A LinkedIn profile for a woman in Cleveland with that name, but she was a corporate lawyer. Not her. A few other scattered, meaningless mentions. It was like looking for a single grain of sand on a beach. I tried again. Eleanor Vance, Ohio. More results, but nothing definitive. Vance was a common enough name. I needed more information. I sat back, chewing on my lip. Where had Eleanor and her family moved? Robert had been vague. Out west somewhere, he'd said once. Arizona? California? It was a needle in a haystack the size of a continent. Then I had an idea. It was macabre, but practical. Obituaries. Obituaries contain details. Family names, locations, dates. I typed Eleanor Vance obituary into the search bar. I scrolled through pages of results for women all over the country. None of them seemed right. They were the wrong age, the wrong location. I was about to give up when I remembered something Robert had once let slip, a tiny detail in one of his nostalgic monologues. Eleanor's husband's name. He'd mentioned it with a sneer. She married a man named David Vance. A real estate man. Thought he was a big shot. My fingers flew across the keyboard. David Vance obituary, Ohio real estate. And there it was. The first result. A link to a legacy website from a local newspaper in a small town about 2 hours north of us. My heart began to pound. I clicked the link. The page loaded, and a grainy, black and white photo of a man in his late 50s appeared. David Vance. The date of death was 7 years ago. I read the short text, my eyes scanning, hungry for details. David Vance, 58, passed away suddenly, a lifelong resident of Northwood, Ohio. He was a passionate real estate developer. He is survived by his beloved wife, Eleanor, and his loving daughter, Chloe. Northwood, Ohio. He was a lifelong resident. They hadn't moved out west. They had lived just 2 hours away this entire time. A real estate developer who had died suddenly at 58. I scrolled down, past the service information, to the guest book. The messages of condolence were from years ago, but they were still there. Dave was a great guy, but he took too many risks. So sorry for your loss, Eleanor. I know things were tough the last few years. He always had a big dream, just couldn't make it stick. A picture began to form. A real estate developer who took risks. Things being tough the last few years. A sudden death at 58. It sounded like a business failure. A heart attack brought on by stress. It sounded like the American dream turning into a nightmare. This was not the story Robert had told me. This was not the man with better prospects who had whisked Eleanor away to a life of ease. This was a man who had struggled and, it seemed, had failed. My blood ran cold. If David Vance had died 7 years ago, what about Eleanor? I opened a new search tab, my hands no longer shaking, but moving with a grim purpose. I typed in the search bar, Eleanor Vance obituary, Northwood, Ohio. The result was immediate. It was from the same local paper. The date of death was just 3 years ago. The photograph was of a woman in her early 60s. Her face was fuller than the girl in Robert's photos, and there were lines of worry etched around her eyes and mouth, but it was unmistakably her. The smile was gone. In its place was a look of profound, bone-deep weariness. It was the same look I had seen on her daughter's face in Walmart. Eleanor Vance, née Miller, 65, passed away peacefully after a long illness. My own maiden name was Miller. For a disorienting second, it felt like I was reading about myself. She was preceded in death by her husband, David. A lifelong artist and homemaker, Eleanor was known for her kindness and her unwavering devotion to her family. She leaves behind her cherished daughter, Chloe, and her grandson, Leo. A long illness, preceded in death by her husband, leaving behind a daughter and a grandson. The perfect, shimmering ghost was gone. In her place was this poor, sad woman. A woman who lost her husband, who suffered through a long illness, and who died, it seemed, without the wealth and security that Robert had always insisted she possessed. The foundation of my life didn't just have a crack in it, it had crumbled into dust. 45 years of feeling inadequate, of being compared to a phantom, and the phantom was just a woman. A woman who had suffered, a woman who had gotten sick, a woman who had died, leaving her daughter to struggle alone. A wave of something complex and overwhelming washed over me. It wasn't triumph. It wasn't vindication. It was a profound, aching sorrow. A sorrow for her, for the life she had clearly lived, so different from the one I had imagined. And a sorrow for me, for the years I had wasted living in her shadow, a shadow that wasn't even real. Robert hadn't been honoring a memory. He had been worshipping a fiction he had used to control and diminish me. My search wasn't over. There was one last thread to pull. Chloe Vance, Northwood, Ohio. This time, a result came up that I had missed before. A public Facebook profile. I clicked on it. The profile picture showed the woman from Walmart, but smiling. She had her arm around a young boy with bright, happy eyes and a missing front tooth. Leo. Her son. The birthday boy. The timeline was sparse, mostly pictures of Leo. Leo at a school play. Leo holding up a drawing. Leo with a new puppy. It was a timeline of a mother's love, a fierce and focused love that was obvious in every single frame. There were no pictures of a husband, no mention of a partner. It was just her and her son. Sprinkled between the photos were shared posts, articles about living on a budget, links to community food banks, and one post, from about a year ago, a link to a GoFundMe page. The title of the page was Help Leo and Chloe Stay in Their Home. My breath caught in my chest. I clicked the link. The page had been started by a friend of hers. It told their story. After her father's death and her mother's long, expensive illness, Chloe had been left with very little. She worked 2 part-time jobs, cleaning houses and waiting tables, but it was a constant struggle to make ends meet, to pay the mortgage on the small house her parents had left her, to care for her son alone. The campaign had raised a few $1,000s, but had fallen far short of its goal. I sat there in the quiet of my perfectly clean, financially secure home, and I stared at the screen. I saw the face of a woman fighting with every ounce of her being to give her son a good life against impossible odds. A woman who had inherited not wealth, but debt and sorrow. The granddaughter of the woman I was supposed to be jealous of. The weight of it all, the decades of quiet suffering, the shocking revelations of the morning, the face of that little boy, Leo, it all became too much to hold inside the silent prison of my own mind. My carefully constructed walls of composure, built over a lifetime of practice, finally broke. A sob escaped my lips, a ragged, ugly sound. I needed to tell someone. I couldn't carry this alone for another minute. I looked at the phone on the table beside the computer. My hand reached for it, my fingers dialing a number that was as familiar to me as my own name. The phone rang twice on the other end. A voice answered, warm and familiar. Mom, is everything okay? You're calling early. It was Sarah, my daughter. My gentle, kind-hearted Sarah. I opened my mouth to speak, to tell her everything, to let the 45-year-old dam of silence finally burst. But the only thing that came out was a choked whisper. Sarah, I said, and my own voice was the voice of a stranger, a woman I hadn't heard from in a very, very long time. I need to tell you a story. The sound of my daughter's voice, a lifeline thrown across 2 states, was the only solid thing in a world that had turned to water. Mom, is everything okay? You're calling early. The concern in her tone was a familiar balm, but today it was also a painful reminder of all the times I had answered her questions with a placid, everything's fine, dear, when my world was quietly crumbling. I had taught my own daughter how to be silent, how to swallow hurt, by my own example. The thought was a fresh stab of pain. Sarah, I began, my voice a ragged whisper that didn't sound like my own. I need to tell you a story. And then the dam broke. Not in a great, crashing flood, but in a steady, unstoppable surge of words held back for nearly half a century. I told her everything, starting with the fluorescent lights of Walmart and the worn-out face of Chloe Vance. I told her about the declined card, the birthday cake, the small act of kindness that had inadvertently picked the lock on my past. My voice gained strength as I spoke, fueled by the sheer, liberating power of a truth finally being aired. I walked her through the late-night archaeology of my search, the clicking of the keyboard a drumbeat counting out the years of deception. I described the obituaries, painting a picture for her of David Vance, the failed dreamer, and Eleanor Vance, the sick and weary woman who was so achingly different from the goddess of her father's mythology. I told her about the GoFundMe page, about little Leo, about the grinding poverty that was Eleanor's true legacy. Then I went deeper. I went back in time, and I gave my daughter the truth of her own childhood, the context she had never had. I told her about the sunroom and my abandoned paints, about how her father had killed my small artistic ambition with a casual comparison. I told her about my friend Carol, and how he had systematically dismantled my one real friendship, isolating me until my world was no bigger than our front door. I told her, my voice cracking, about the winter coat, about the calculated humiliation of begging for necessities. I explained that the pressure he'd put on Michael, his relentless drive for his son to be a winner, was born from his own feelings of inadequacy, his own loss of Eleanor to a man he deemed a big shot. And then, the hardest part. And you, my darling Sarah, I said, tears now streaming down my face, hot and cleansing. His indifference to you, it was never about you. You were perfect. You are perfect. But you were a girl. You weren't a replacement for the son he imagined he would have had with her. You were a reminder of me, of his second choice. There was a long silence on the other end of the line. Not a disconnect, but a heavy, weighted silence. I could hear her breathing, a soft, shaky sound. When she finally spoke, her voice was thick with unshed tears, but it was also laced with a cold, hard anger I had never heard from my gentle daughter before. All those years, she said, her voice low and trembling. All those years I thought it was me. I thought I wasn't smart enough or interesting enough. I spent my whole life trying to get him to just see me. And it was all because of a ghost? A story he made up. Yes, I whispered. It was. Mom, she said, her voice firming. I'm coming home. I'll get the first flight I can. A month ago, a week ago, even yesterday morning, I would have clung to that offer. I would have needed her here to hold my hand, to be my shield. But something had shifted in me during the telling. Voicing the truth had not just exposed Robert's lies, it had exposed my own strength, a strength I had forgotten I possessed. No, sweetie, I said, and I was shocked by the clarity in my own voice. Thank you. Just hearing you believe me, that's more than enough. But this is my house. He is my husband. This is my mess to clean up. I have to do this myself. We talked for another hour. For the first time, we talked not as a mother and a dutiful daughter, but as two women. Two women who had been shaped and scarred by the same man, albeit in different ways. By the time we hung up, the sun was high in the sky. I felt exhausted, hollowed out, but I also felt light. The 45-year-old weight of another woman's imagined perfection had been lifted from my shoulders. I spent the rest of the morning in a strange daze, walking through the rooms of my own house as if I were a visitor. This was the museum of my life, but now I understood the placards. The formal living room, with its stiff, uncomfortable furniture that Robert had picked out, was a monument to a social life we never had. It was a room for the doctors and lawyers he imagined Eleanor socialized with. We hadn't entertained in it for 15 years. His study, which I had always been tacitly forbidden from entering, was no longer a scary seat of power. It was the sad fortress of a man hiding from his own mediocrity. I stood in the doorway and looked at his perfectly ordered desk, his leather-bound books, the silver-framed photo of his parents. It was all a stage set, a carefully curated image of a successful man. But I now knew it was a performance to convince himself as much as anyone else. I thought about my son, Michael. I had always been vaguely afraid of him, of his sharp suits and his sharper tongue, so much like his father. But now I felt a deep pity for him. He hadn't just inherited his father's ambition, he had inherited his sickness. The need to win at all costs, the emotional sterility, the worship of success as the only metric of a man's worth. He was running a race his father had set for him, a race against the ghost of a man Eleanor had supposedly married. He was chasing a phantom, just as I had been living in the shadow of one. The damage was generational. Robert's quiet cruelty hadn't just poisoned our marriage, it had flowed downstream, poisoning our children's lives, too. The anger returned, cold and pure. This wasn't just about me anymore. This was about Sarah's years of feeling invisible. This was about Michael's joyless pursuit of a hollow prize. This was about a little boy named Leo who was eating macaroni for his 10th birthday because his grandfather was a man who had preferred a beautiful lie to the complicated truth. I knew the confrontation was inevitable. It could not be avoided. Robert would be home from his walk soon, expecting lunch, expecting the quiet, orderly compliance that had been the background music of his entire life. But the music had stopped. I didn't plan what I would say. I didn't need to. The truth, after decades of being buried, was clamoring to be heard. I just had to open my mouth and let it out. He came in through the back door, whistling softly, a habit he had when he felt particularly pleased with himself. "Evelyn," he called out, heading for the living room. "Anything in the mail?" I didn't answer. I stood in the kitchen, by the island, my hands resting flat on the cool granite. I waited. He appeared in the doorway a moment later, his placid expression slowly curdling into one of mild irritation as he saw me just standing there. The table wasn't set for lunch. The house was too quiet. "Is something wrong?" he asked, his tone already laced with accusation, as if my stillness was a personal affront. "Robert," I said, my voice even and low. "I went to Walmart yesterday." He blinked. "All right. And? Did you forget my coffee again?" "No," I said. "I met someone. A woman in line. She couldn't pay for her groceries. It was for her son's 10th birthday." He sighed, the sigh of a man whose profound thoughts were being interrupted by domestic trivia. "Evelyn, if this is about you giving away our money to strangers." "Her name was Chloe Vance," I said. The name dropped into the air between us. It hung there for a long moment. I watched his face. For the first time in years, I saw a genuine, unguarded emotion there. Pure, unadulterated shock. His jaw went slack. The color drained from his face. "Vance," he repeated, his voice a dry rasp. "Yes. I paid for her things, Robert. $130. For a birthday cake and some hot dogs. And when I got home, I was curious. So I looked her up. And I looked up her mother." I held his gaze, my own eyes unflinching. I had looked away for 45 years. I would not look away now. I found her obituary, Robert. Eleanor's. She died 3 years ago in Northwood, just 2 hours from here, after a long illness. He staggered back a step, as if I had physically struck him. He leaned against the doorframe for support. "You're lying," he breathed. "Am I?" I continued, my voice gaining momentum. "I also found her husband's obituary. David Vance, the real estate man, died 7 years ago. Suddenly. It seems his big dreams didn't quite pan out. The condolence messages spoke of risks and tough times. He didn't whisk her away to a life of luxury, did he, Robert? They lived and struggled and died just up the road." He shook his head, a frantic, desperate motion. This is insane. You've become hysterical, Evelyn. Snooping around in people's private lives. It's morbid. "It's the truth," I said, my voice like steel. "And it gets worse. Or better, depending on your point of view. Chloe, her daughter, is raising her son alone. She's cleaning houses to try and keep the home her parents left her. There was a GoFundMe page. They're drowning in debt, it seems. The debt from her mother's long illness. This is the legacy, Robert. This is what became of your perfect Eleanor. Not a goddess. Not a queen. Just a poor woman who got sick and died, and a daughter trying to survive." He stared at me, his mouth opening and closing, but no sound came out. The curator was standing in the ruins of his museum. All his carefully preserved artifacts had been smashed. 45 years, I said, and now the personal grievances, the ones I had swallowed until they had almost become part of me, came pouring out. "For 45 years, you have held that woman over my head. My painting wasn't good enough because Eleanor was a real artist. My friends weren't good enough because Eleanor's friends were from good families. I wasn't smart enough, interesting enough, good enough. You used her, you used your memory of a teenage girl to keep me in a cage. You built a prison for me out of your own pathetic nostalgia." "That's not true," he finally managed, his voice a pathetic whisper. "I loved you." "No," I said, the word of final, damning judgment. "You didn't. You loved the idea of a wife. An adequate wife. You loved the quiet, the order, the fact that I never challenged you. You didn't love me. You couldn't. You were too busy loving a ghost. And you punished me for not being her. You punished Sarah for not being her son. You let your whole life, our whole life, be dictated by a fantasy. And the whole time, the real Eleanor Vance was 2 hours away, watching her husband fail, getting sick, and dying with nothing. Your great romance was a fiction you told yourself to feel important. And I paid the price for it. I fell silent. I had said it all. The contents of the screaming void had been given voice, and now the silence that followed was different. It was clean. Empty. He pushed himself off the doorframe, his face a mask of gray, aged disbelief. He looked like what he was, an old man whose grand illusion had just been stripped away. He didn't yell. He didn't argue. He simply turned and walked, unsteadily, toward his study and closed the door. The click of the latch was the loudest sound I had ever heard. The weeks that followed were the strangest of my life. We lived in the same house, but we were planets in different orbits. He stayed mostly in his study. I cooked for him, left his meals on a tray outside the door, as you would for a convalescent. We didn't speak. The silence was no longer oppressive, it was a boundary. A border I had drawn around my own life. He had retreated into his fortress, but I now knew the walls were made of paper. The power was gone. During that time, I began to live. They were small acts at first. I opened a bank account in my own name, transferring half of our shared savings into it. It was my money, too. I had earned it with 45 years of unpaid labor. I called Sarah and told her what I had done, and she cheered. I drove to the garden center and bought 3 flats of petunias, the most vibrant, shocking pink I could find, and I planted them all along the front walk, a brazen splash of color against the staid brick of the house. Robert would have hated them. The thought made me smile. But my biggest act was Chloe. I couldn't stop thinking about her and about Leo. To just send money felt wrong. It felt like what Robert would do, a transactional solution to a human problem. It felt like charity, and that would only be another form of humiliation. This required something more. This required connection. After a week of composing and rewriting, I wrote her a letter. I didn't use the fancy stationery Robert insisted we keep for thank you notes. I used a simple, plain piece of paper. Dear Chloe, I wrote. You don't know me, but we were in the same checkout line at the Walmart in my town a few weeks ago. My name is Evelyn Carter. I hope this letter doesn't feel like an intrusion. I've thought about you and your son, Leo, a great deal since that day. I've found myself thinking about your mother, Eleanor. It's a long story, and perhaps a strange one, but I knew of her many, many years ago. I know she passed away, and I am so very sorry for your loss, and for the loss of your father. Grief is a heavy burden to carry, especially when you are also carrying everything else. I paused, choosing my next words with immense care. I am an old woman now. My own children are grown and live far away. My house is too quiet. You are trying to raise a son, and from what I saw, you are doing a beautiful, brave job of it. I am not writing to offer charity. I am writing to offer friendship. If you would ever allow it, I'd love to meet you and Leo. I make an excellent roast chicken, and I have a yard that is perfect for a 10-year-old boy to run around in. Perhaps I could be a kind of adopted grandmother. Or, if that is too much, just a friend. Please don't feel you have to respond. But I hope you will. I sealed the envelope and mailed it. And then I waited. It was a different kind of waiting than any I had done before. I wasn't waiting for permission or for a mood to pass. I was waiting for a new chapter of my life to begin. One day, I went up to the attic. I found the old easel, folded in the corner, shrouded in a dusty sheet. I carried it downstairs, my old bones protesting, but my heart feeling young. I cleaned it, polished the wood, and set it up in the sunroom. The room I had finally reclaimed. I didn't have any paints, not yet. But the easel stood there, by the window, in the bright afternoon light. It was a promise. A week later, an envelope arrived. The handwriting on the front was unfamiliar. It was from Northwood. It was from Chloe. My hands trembled as I opened it. The note inside was short. Dear Evelyn, it read. Thank you for your letter. And for the birthday cake. Leo said it was the best he ever had. We would love to have roast chicken with you. My number is... I stood there in my quiet hallway, holding the note in my hand. Through the open door of the sunroom, I could see the empty easel, waiting. Robert was in his study, a ghost in his own house. The war was over. The cage was open. I had spent 45 years living in the shadow of a woman I had never met. Now, I was about to have lunch with her daughter. I had paid a small price for a stranger in a grocery store, and in return, I had been given the one thing I never knew I could have. I had been given back my own life. And I was finally ready to pay for it, not with money, but with courage. Not with silence, but with joy.